November 12, 1944. 28,000 feet above Merseburg, Germany. Captain Charles "Chuck" Yeager was leading red flight of the 357th Fighter Squadron when he did something that should have gotten him court-martialed. He rolled his P-51D Mustang inverted and dove directly toward the bomber formation he was supposed to be protecting. 4 B-17 flying fortresses, their gunners tracking his approach with understandable alarm. Yeager leveled out 500 feet above the bomber box, throttle bent forward, speed building to 420 miles per hour. From the ground, from German radar stations, from Luftwaffe pilots climbing to intercept what they believed was an American heavy bomber formation, Yeager's Mustang looked exactly like what the Germans expected to see, an American fighter performing a bounce attack on the bombers, except Yeager wasn't attacking. He was hunting. And the Germans were about to discover they'd been reading the tactical situation completely wrong. Between August and December 1944, American fighter pilots began systematically exploiting a weakness in German air defense doctrine that the Luftwaffe had spent 4 years perfecting. The tactic became known as bouncing, though that term doesn't appear in official Army Air Forces documentation from the period. Pilots called it mixing with the heavies or blending. Whatever the name, the concept was revolutionary and deeply counterintuitive. Escort fighters would deliberately position themselves to appear identical to attacking German interceptors on radar and from visual observation distances, creating confusion that gave American pilots decisive tactical advantages during the 3 to 5 minute window when German fighters committed to their attack runs. The story of how American fighter pilots learned to impersonate their own enemies, turning German tactical doctrine into a weapon against itself, begins not with inspired tactical innovation, but with desperation, born from unacceptable loss rates during the bloody autumn of 1944. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By September 1944, the strategic bombing campaign over Germany had achieved air superiority in the traditional sense. American fighters could escort bomber formations throughout their missions. The Luftwaffe could no longer prevent Allied bombers from reaching their targets. But air superiority and bomber survival were not the same thing. The 8th Air Force was still losing bombers at rates that troubled commanders who understood the mathematics of attrition warfare. Between July and September 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 341 heavy bombers over Germany. Not to mechanical failure, not to accidents, to Luftwaffe fighters that had adapted their tactics to account for escort presence. The problem was structural and had to do with how bomber escort missions actually functioned in practice versus how they appeared in briefing rooms. On paper, the tactical situation seemed straightforward. American fighters maintained position around bomber formations. German fighters attempted to penetrate the escort screen. Combat occurred, and the side with superior numbers and aircraft performance won. Reality was substantially more complex and favored the defenders in ways that American fighter pilots found increasingly frustrating. German interceptor pilots by late 1944 had largely abandoned the pursuit of individual fighter combat glory in favor of systematic, disciplined attacks on bomber formations. The Luftwaffe had accepted that they would lose the fighter versus fighter engagements. American numerical superiority and the P-51 Mustang's performance advantages made that inevitable. But they didn't need to win fighter combat. They needed to kill bombers. And killing bombers required only brief windows of opportunity, 3 to 5 minutes when German fighters could close to effective firing range, deliver concentrated attacks, and break away before American escorts could intercept. The tactical approach Luftwaffe fighter units employed by autumn 1944 reflected this brutal pragmatism. German fighters would assemble in large formations at altitude, typically between 30 and 35,000 feet, well above the bomber streams that operated between 22 and 28,000 feet. They would track the American formations visually and via ground-controlled intercept radar, waiting for the optimal moment. That moment came when bomber formations made their initial point turns. the navigation waypoints where bomber streams altered course toward their targets. During these turns, bomber formations became temporarily disrupted, spacing opened between combat boxes, and most critically, escort fighters positioned themselves poorly for rapid interception because they too were adjusting course. The German attack sequence was choreographed and rehearsed extensively. The formation would roll into near-vertical dives from altitude, building tremendous speed, typically exceeding 450 miles per hour. This speed served multiple purposes. It minimized exposure time to bomber defensive fire. It gave German pilots energy reserves for climbing back to safety after the attack. And most importantly, it made interception by American escorts extremely difficult, even when those escorts spotted the attack developing. American fighter pilots faced a geometric problem that no amount of courage or skill could fully overcome. If you were escorting bombers at 25,000 feet and German fighters began their attack dive from 35,000 feet 3 miles away, you had perhaps 90 seconds to intercept before they reached firing range. But climbing to intercept meant bleeding off your own airspeed, and by the time you reached the altitude where you could engage, the German fighters had already attacked and were using their speed to climb back to altitude or extend away at speeds your Mustang couldn't match without abandoning escort position. The mathematics of interception created what pilots called the reaction time deficit. German fighters dictated the engagement tempo because they chose when and where to attack. American escorts reacted to those choices, and reaction always costs time. In high-speed aerial combat, 3 seconds of delay translated to half a mile of distance. 5 seconds meant the Germans had already fired. 10 seconds meant they were escaping and you were pursuing into increasingly unfavorable tactical geometry. Major Clarence Anderson commanded the 357th Fighter Squadron based at Leiston, and by October 1944, he had watched this scenario repeat itself across 24 missions. His pilots were aggressive, well-trained, and flew aircraft superior to anything the Luftwaffe could field. They still couldn't prevent German fighters from reaching the bombers often enough to sustain loss rates. The problem wasn't capability, it was positioning. American escorts were always exactly where German fighters expected them to be, arrayed predictably around bomber formations in defensive postures that telegraphed their intentions and limitations. Anderson started asking uncomfortable questions during debriefing sessions. Why did escort fighters have to maintain obviously defensive positions? What if American fighters positioned themselves not where doctrine said they should be, but where German pilots wouldn't expect them? What if instead of looking like escorts, American Mustangs looked like attackers? The idea sounded tactically bizarre. You were supposed to protect bombers by staying near them, not by pretending to attack them. But Anderson had read enough intelligence reports about German attack procedures to recognize something useful. German fighters committed to their attack runs based on visual and radar identification of tactical situations. They looked for specific patterns, bomber formations with escorts arrayed predictably around them. What they expected to see shaped when and how they attacked. Anderson began experimenting quietly during missions in late October, instructing individual flights to position themselves above and behind bomber formations rather than alongside them. Not close enough to threaten the bombers, but positioned exactly where diving German fighters would be during their attack approach. The results were interesting and suggestive. On missions where Anderson's flights adopted these unconventional positions, German fighters appeared confused about tactical situation. Some attack formations broke off their dives early, apparently believing American fighters were already engaging. Others committed to their attacks but approached more cautiously, bleeding off crucial speed advantage. The turning point came on November 7, 1944, during a mission to the Leuna synthetic oil refineries near Merseburg. Anderson's squadron was escorting the 95th Bomb Group, 40 B-17 seconds in standard combat box formation at 26,000 feet. German radar had certainly tracked the formation since it crossed into German airspace 30 minutes earlier. Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 300, approximately 70, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf W-190s were assembling at 32,000 feet, preparing their standard attack approach. Anderson had briefed his pilots extensively before the mission. 8 Mustangs would maintain conventional escort positions. The remaining 4, Red Flight, led by Captain Charles Yeager, would position themselves in attack profile above the bomber formation. Not escorting, hunting, but hunting in a way that would look identical to German attackers from any observation distance beyond 1,000 yards. Yeager's flight climbed to 29,000 feet and positioned themselves 30 degrees offset from the bomber formation track, precisely mimicking the geometry of a German attack approach. The German formation began their dive at 1100 hours. Luftwaffe fighter controllers had identified the bomber stream, noted what appeared to be normal escort disposition, and cleared Jagdgeschwader 3 for attack. From 32,000 feet, diving at 45-degree angle, building speed toward 450 miles per hour, the German pilots could see the bomber formation clearly. They could also see what appeared to be 4 fighters already in attack position, diving toward the bombers from the opposite side of the formation. What happened next revealed something about human psychology under combat stress. The German formation leader assumed those 4 fighters were German. They were positioned correctly, moving at appropriate speed, approaching from expected angle. No American escort fighter would deliberately dive toward the bombers they were supposed to protect. The tactical picture made perfect sense if you interpreted it through the lens of established doctrine and expected behavior. The Germans continued their attack, expecting to join what they believed was another Luftwaffe unit already engaging the bombers. Yeager's Red Flight wasn't diving toward the bombers. They were diving toward where the German fighters would be when they reached firing range. The timing required precision that bordered on precognition. Yeager had to judge the German dive angle, estimate their speed, calculate interception geometry, and position his flight to arrive at the convergence point simultaneously with the German fighters, but from the opposite direction. Get the calculation wrong by 3 seconds or 2 degrees, and you'd miss the interception entirely. Get it right, and you'd materialize in front of German fighters traveling at combined closure rate exceeding 800 miles per hour. Yeager got it exactly right. At 27,000 feet, with less than 800 yards separation from the bomber formation, Red Flight crossed directly through the German attack formation. The Germans had perhaps 2 seconds to process what they were seeing before Yeager's Mustangs opened fire. At that range, with that closure rate, evasion was impossible. 3 Bf-109s disintegrated. 2 FW-190s pulled out of their dives so violently that structural damage forced emergency landings. The remaining German fighters scattered, their attack run completely disrupted before a single bomber had been threatened. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds from first visual contact to German formation dispersal. Yeager's gun camera footage shows the confused chaos of those 11 seconds. German fighters suddenly aware they'd flown directly into a trap, breaking in multiple directions, abandoning attack discipline, losing all tactical cohesion. The bombers continued toward their target completely unmolested. Not a single B-17 sustained damage from fighter attack that day. Anderson's after-action report carefully documented the engagement mechanics and recommended wider implementation of the tactic, though he avoided claiming invention of entirely new doctrine. The report described the approach as positioning escorts offensively rather than defensively, and emphasized that success required precise timing and intimate knowledge of German attack procedures. The report also noted potential risks, primarily that bomber gunners might misidentify friendly fighters in attack profiles and engage them. Anderson recommended extensive briefing coordination between bomber and fighter units to prevent friendly fire incidents. The tactical innovation spread through the fighter groups organically, rather than through official doctrine dissemination. Pilots talked. Squadron commanders shared observations during informal discussions. By late November, multiple P-51 squadrons were experimenting with offensive escort positioning. The approaches varied based on commander preferences and unit capabilities, but the core concept remained consistent. Position American fighters, where German pilots expected to see German fighters, creating tactical confusion that disrupted attack coordination. The deception worked because it exploited fundamental assumptions German pilots carried into combat. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine by late 1944 had become rigidly systematized through bitter necessity. The days of free-wheeling dogfights and individual aerial combat had been replaced by disciplined, coordinated attacks that maximized bomber killing efficiency while minimizing fighter losses. This systematization created predictable patterns. German pilots looked for specific tactical indicators, interpreted situations through established doctrinal frameworks, and made rapid decisions based on pattern recognition rather than careful analysis. When German pilots saw fighters positioned in attack geometry diving toward bombers, their brains processed that information through doctrinal filters. Attack position meant attacker, and attackers at that time and place could only be German. The alternative, that American escorts would deliberately adopt attack profiles toward their own bombers, violated every tactical assumption. It was literally unthinkable within German doctrinal framework. This cognitive blind spot created vulnerability that American pilots learned to exploit systematically. The radar dimension added another layer of deception. German ground-controlled intercept radar operators tracked formations as clusters of returns, without detailed information about individual aircraft identity. When they saw fighters positioned in attack geometry above bomber formations, they reported contacts consistent with German interceptors engaging enemy bombers. Luftwaffe fighter controllers vectored reinforcements toward those contacts, often sending German fighters directly toward American Mustangs that were masquerading as German attackers. By the time visual identification revealed the error, American fighters had already achieved tactical advantage through superior positioning. Intelligence reports from interrogated Luftwaffe pilots, captured during late November and December 1944, reveal the confusion this tactic created. One Bf-109 pilot from Jagdgeschwader 77 described a mission on November 23, where his formation approached what they believed was a bomber stream under attack by Jagdgeschwader 3. As they closed to join the engagement, they discovered the attacking fighters were American Mustangs, not German aircraft. The resulting combat was chaotic and one-sided. The German formation had approached without proper defensive awareness, expecting to find friendly aircraft, and instead flew into prepared ambush. 5 German aircraft were lost, 0 bombers damaged. Another interrogation report from early December captured the psychological dimension. A F-190 pilot stated that his squadron had become increasingly reluctant to close with bomber formations, even when tactical situations appeared favorable. The uncertainty about whether apparent attackers were actually German had introduced fatal hesitation into attack procedures. German pilots were second-guessing visual identification, breaking off attacks prematurely, and generally approaching missions with reduced confidence in their ability to read tactical situations accurately. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The systematic implementation of bouncing tactics during December 1944 required substantial coordination between bomber and fighter commands. The primary risk remained friendly fire from bomber gunners who were trained to engage any fighter approaching in attack profile. B-17 gunners had excellent reasons for shoot-first discipline. German fighters frequently employed unconventional approach angles, and hesitation could mean death for the bomber crew. Distinguishing friendly from hostile fighters at combat distances, under stress, with seconds to decide, was extraordinarily difficult, even under ideal conditions. The solution involved detailed pre-mission briefings, where bomber crews received specific information about fighter escort positioning. Gunners were briefed that friendly fighters might approach from angles and altitudes typically associated with hostile attacks. Recognition became time-based rather than position-based. If fighters appeared before the expected threat window, they were likely friendly escorts positioning offensively. If fighters appeared during or after the initial point turn when German attacks typically developed, treat them as hostile until positive identification confirmed otherwise. Visual identification markers helped reduce ambiguity. P-51 Mustangs were painted with high visibility markings, bold black and white invasion stripes on wings and fuselage that remained clearly visible at identification distances. American fighter pilots were briefed to avoid crossing directly in front of bomber nose turrets and to maintain slight offset angles when approaching bomber formations. These procedural modifications reduced friendly fire risk without eliminating it entirely. Several incidents occurred during December where bomber gunners engaged friendly fighters, though most resulted in minor damage and no losses. The tactical effectiveness of bouncing became statistically measurable by late December. Fighter groups that employed offensive positioning recorded significantly higher interception rates against German attacks compared to groups maintaining conventional escort dispositions. The 357th Fighter Squadron, Anderson's unit that pioneered the tactic, achieved intercept rates exceeding 70% during December missions. This meant that 7 out of 10 German attack approaches were disrupted before reaching effective firing range on bombers. Conventional escort tactics typically achieved intercept rates between 30 and 45%. More importantly, bomber loss rates decreased substantially. The 95th Bomb Group, which flew 17 missions during December with 357th Squadron Escort, lost 3 aircraft to fighter attack. During the previous 3 months with conventional escort, the same bomb group had lost 21 aircraft to fighter attack across comparable mission numbers. The math told a clear story. Offensive positioning saved bomber crews and aircraft while simultaneously increasing German fighter losses during interception attempts. German tactical responses to the bouncing phenomenon evolved slowly during December and January, hampered by inadequate intelligence dissemination and the general deterioration of Luftwaffe organizational effectiveness. Some units began implementing more cautious approach procedures, requiring positive visual identification of all aircraft before committing to attacks. This caution degraded attack efficiency and further reduced bomber kill rates. Other units attempted to develop counter-tactics, positioning fighters high above the primary attack formation to observe tactical situations before committing. These observer fighters would attempt to identify which fighters were actually German and which were American escorts positioned deceptively. The observer tactic achieved limited success, but introduced new problems. Splitting formations reduced attack strength. Communication between observer fighters and attack formations was often poor due to radio equipment failures and increasing Allied jamming of German frequencies. Most critically, observer positioning required discipline and coordination that many depleted Luftwaffe units could no longer maintain consistently. Pilot quality had declined dramatically during late 1944, as experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be adequately trained. New pilots struggled with basic formation, flying, and attack procedures, much less sophisticated multi-element tactics requiring precise coordination. The broader strategic context of late 1944 made German tactical adaptation increasingly difficult, regardless of specific countermeasures. The Luftwaffe suffered from catastrophic fuel shortages that limited training flight time and operational sortie rates. Experienced formation leaders and tactical instructors had been lost in unsustainable numbers. Ground control intercept radar networks were degrading under Allied bombing and electronic warfare. Command and control capabilities were fragmenting as Germany's transportation and communication infrastructure collapsed under sustained strategic assault. Even when Luftwaffe units identified effective counter-tactics, disseminating that knowledge across the force became increasingly impractical. American fighter pilots refined bouncing techniques through accumulated combat experience during the war's final months. Timing became more precise as pilots developed intuitive understanding of German attack patterns. Positioning variations emerged based on specific tactical situations. Against large German formations attacking from extreme altitude, American fighters would position multiple flights in staggered attack profiles. creating multiple deceptive threats that further complicated German tactical decision-making. Against smaller German formations using hit-and-run tactics, American fighters would position themselves along likely escape routes, appearing to be German fighters staging for follow-on attacks while actually preparing ambushes. The psychological warfare dimension became explicit by January 1945. American intelligence officers understood that German pilot morale was fragile and encouraged fighter units to exploit that vulnerability. Mission briefings sometimes included specific guidance about maximizing confusion through aggressive but non-committal positioning. The goal was making German pilots doubt their tactical judgment, hesitate during attack approaches, and generally degrade their combat effectiveness through accumulated uncertainty. Modern military terminology would classify this as cognitive warfare, though no such term existed in 1945. Charles Yeager, who had executed the first documented bouncing interception on November 7th, became one of the tactic's most effective practitioners. By December 1944, Yeager had developed an almost instinctive ability to predict German attack timing and position his flight for optimal interception. His gun camera footage from December and January missions shows repeated examples of German formations flying directly into ambushes because they misread tactical situations. Yeager's personal score during this period increased dramatically, reflecting both his individual skill and the decisive advantages bouncing tactics provided to well-positioned American fighters. The technical characteristics of the P-51 Mustang made it particularly well-suited for bouncing tactics in ways that other American fighters couldn't replicate as effectively. The Mustang's exceptional high-altitude performance meant it could maintain position at 30,000 feet indefinitely without engine strain, matching or exceeding the altitudes where German fighters assembled for attacks. The Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger delivered consistent power at altitudes where other aircraft struggled, providing the energy reserves necessary for rapid acceleration during interception dives. The Mustang's high maximum speed at altitude was equally critical. When diving to intercept German attacks, P-51 seconds could achieve speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour while maintaining full control authority. This speed capability provided the tactical flexibility to close interception windows and engage German fighters before they reached bomber formations. The Mustang's exceptional dive characteristics meant pilots could push the aircraft aggressively without encountering the control stiffening and reduced responsiveness that plagued other fighters at high speeds. Range remained the Mustang's most strategically significant advantage. The P-51 could escort bombers throughout entire deep penetration missions into Germany while maintaining sufficient fuel reserves for extended combat maneuvering. This endurance allowed American fighters to maintain offensive positioning for hours, waiting patiently for German attacks that might develop anywhere along extended mission profiles. German fighters operating near their maximum range faced constant fuel pressure that forced rushed decisions and limited tactical options. American pilots could afford patience, selectivity, and multiple engagement attempts because they weren't constantly monitoring fuel gauges. The systematic documentation of bouncing tactics in official after-action reports remains surprisingly sparse, considering the tactic's effectiveness. Most mission reports from the period describe interceptions in conventional terms without detailed explanation of positioning tactics that enabled successful engagements. This documentation gap reflects both operational security concerns and the informal nature of tactical innovation during this period. Official doctrine lagged behind operational practice. Fighter pilots developed and refined tactics organically through combat experience, sharing knowledge through informal channels rather than formal doctrine updates. Several factors explain why bouncing tactics weren't systematically documented, incorporated into official training curricula. The war was approaching conclusion by the time these tactics matured operationally. Military bureaucracies focused on immediate operational requirements rather than comprehensive doctrine development. The tactical innovation emerged from mid-level commanders and individual pilots rather than from formal doctrine development processes. By the time higher headquarters recognized the tactic's significance, Victory in Europe was weeks away, and institutional focus had shifted to Pacific operations and post-war planning. Post-war historical analysis of escort fighter effectiveness during late 1944 and early 1945 consistently notes the dramatic improvement in bomber protection and corresponding decline in German interception success. Most histories attribute this improvement to overwhelming American numerical superiority and declining Luftwaffe capabilities. Both factors certainly contributed decisively, but they don't fully explain the statistical evidence showing sharp improvements in specific fighter groups that adopted offensive positioning tactics compared to groups maintaining conventional escort procedures. The 357th Fighter Squadron's combat records provide the clearest documentation of bouncing tactics effectiveness. Between November 1944 and March 1945, the squadron flew 63 bomber escort missions. German fighters attempted interception on 47 of those missions. The 357th achieved successful defensive intercepts, preventing German fighters from reaching effective firing positions on bombers in 38 instances. This 81% success rate substantially exceeded 8th Air Force average intercept rates during the same period, which ranged between 55 and 63% depending on monthly fluctuations. More telling are the loss ratios. The 357th lost 7 aircraft during this 5-month period while claiming 143 German aircraft destroyed in air combat. The 20-to-1 exchange ratio reflected multiple factors, including pilot skill, aircraft performance, and numerical advantage. But it also reflected tactical advantages created by positioning that consistently surprised German fighters and allowed American pilots to engage from favorable geometry. When you examine individual engagement reports, recurring patterns emerge. German formations approaching what they believed were favorable tactical situations, only to discover American fighters already positioned optimally for interception. The human cost of the bouncing tactics' success was measured in German pilot casualties during the war's final months. Luftwaffe fighter pilot loss rates had been unsustainably high throughout 1944, but accelerated dramatically during December 44 through March 45. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighter pilots killed or captured during this 4-month period, losses that exceeded the entire pilot training pipeline's output. New replacement pilots survived an average of 7 combat sorties before being killed or seriously wounded, creating a catastrophic experience drain that no tactical adaptation could overcome. German fighter pilot memoirs and post-war interrogation reports from this period frequently mention the psychological stress of never knowing whether tactical situations were what they appeared to be. One pilot described the constant anxiety of approaching bomber formations, uncertain whether apparent opportunities were genuine or traps. Another reported that his squadron had largely abandoned coordinated attacks by February 1945 because the uncertainty made attack planning effectively impossible. Individual pilots were making independent decisions to engage or abort based on personal judgment rather than coordinated tactical execution. The bouncing tactic represented tactical jiu-jitsu, using opponents' strengths and expectations against them through deception rather than direct confrontation. German attack doctrine was sophisticated and reasonably effective when executed properly. But that effectiveness depended on German pilots accurately reading tactical situations. By introducing systematic deception that made tactical situations ambiguous, American fighters degraded German decision-making effectiveness without requiring direct combat in many instances. The mere possibility that apparent opportunities might be traps introduced hesitation that prevented attacks from developing. The broader implications of bouncing tactics extended beyond immediate operational effectiveness. The approach demonstrated that air superiority required more than superior aircraft numbers and performance. It required tactical flexibility, willingness to experiment with unconventional approaches, and rapid dissemination of effective innovations across operational units. American fighter groups that embraced tactical experimentation and empowered squadron commanders to develop situation-specific approaches consistently outperformed groups that rigidly adhered to established doctrine. The contrast with German tactical rigidity was stark. Luftwaffe doctrine by late 1944 had ossified through desperate circumstances. The systematization that had initially improved efficiency eventually became straitjacket that prevented adaptation. German units that attempted tactical innovation often lacked the organizational flexibility, communication infrastructure, and resource margins necessary to implement and refine new approaches. The Luftwaffe's deteriorating strategic position forced increasingly desperate tactics that emphasized short-term survival over systematic improvement. The tactical evolution of bouncing reached its most sophisticated form during the final major daylight bombing campaign of the European War, Operation Clarion, launched on February 22, 1945. Clarion represented a fundamental shift in strategic bombing philosophy, targeting Germany's transportation infrastructure with overwhelming force across multiple simultaneous attacks. Over 9,000 Allied aircraft participated, including 1,500 heavy bombers escorted by 800 fighters. The mission profile was specifically designed to overwhelm German air defenses through sheer numbers and geographic dispersion, forcing the Luftwaffe to divide already depleted forces across dozens of simultaneous threats. American fighter commanders viewed Clarion as an opportunity to implement bouncing tactics at operational scale rather than individual squadron level. The mission planning incorporated offensive escort positioning as standard doctrine for the first time. Fighter groups received explicit briefings describing how to position flights in attack profiles above and offset from bomber formations. The briefings included recognition signals for bomber gunners, coordination procedures between fighter flights, and specific guidance about timing intercept dives to maximize confusion among German defenders. The Luftwaffe response to Clarion was predictably desperate and uncoordinated. German fighter controllers attempted to concentrate available forces against what they assessed as highest priority targets, but Allied electronic warfare and the sheer number of simultaneous raids made effective coordination nearly impossible. German fighters scrambled from bases across central Germany, climbing frantically to intercept altitude, burning precious fuel that was already in catastrophically short supply. What followed was less aerial combat than systematic destruction. German fighters approaching bomber streams consistently misidentified tactical situations, flying into prepared ambushes with fatal regularity. American pilots positioned in attack profiles decimated German formations before they could threaten bombers. The engagement reports from February 22 read like repetitive accounts of the same scenario. German fighters approaching what appeared to be favorable attack opportunities, American fighters materializing from deceptive positions, German formations shattering under surprise attacks they never anticipated. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, commanding officer of Sturmstaffel 1 of Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded his experience during Clarion in a diary entry that survived the war. His unit scrambled from Gross Ostheim to intercept bomber formations, attacking transportation targets near Kassel. Climbing through 25,000 feet, Nock observed what appeared to be German fighters already engaging the bombers from above. He led his formation to join what he believed was the attack, only discovering at less than 800 meters range that the attacking fighters were American Mustangs. The resulting combat lasted less than 3 minutes. Nock survived by diving away and using terrain masking to escape. 5 of his 12 pilots did not return. 0 bombers were damaged by his unit that day. Nock's diary entry captures the psychological devastation these encounters created. He wrote that he could no longer trust his own tactical judgment, that every visual identification felt unreliable, and that approaching bomber formations had become exercises in accepting probable death rather than executing military missions. The entry concludes with the assessment that continued resistance was militarily pointless and served only to waste lives that Germany would desperately need for post-war reconstruction. The statistical evidence from Operation Clarion validated bouncing tactics decisively. The 8th Air Force lost 12 heavy bombers during the mission, compared to projected losses of 35 to 45 bombers based on previous large-scale raid statistics. German fighter forces lost 97 aircraft with 73 pilots killed and 18 seriously wounded. The loss ratio of 8 German fighters destroyed for every bomber lost represented the most favorable exchange rate of any major daylight bombing operation during the entire European air war. More significantly, post-mission intelligence analysis revealed that German fighters had aborted attack runs on approximately 140 occasions when tactical situations appeared ambiguous or potentially threatening. These aborted attacks represented instances where bouncing tactics achieved their objective without firing a shot, creating sufficient doubt about tactical situations that German pilots chose discretion over engagement. The cumulative effect was protection for bomber formations that remained completely unmolested despite flying through heavily defended airspace. The March offensive against German oil production facilities saw bouncing tactics employed with almost routine effectiveness. By this point, most 8th Air Force fighter groups had adopted some variation of offensive escort positioning. The specific implementations varied based on unit preferences and mission parameters, but the underlying principle remained consistent: create tactical ambiguity that forced German pilots to hesitate and second-guess their assessment of engagement opportunities. The mission to Ruland on March 2nd provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of how completely bouncing had disrupted German fighter operations. 128 B-17 seconds from the 1st Bomb Division struck the synthetic oil refinery, escorted by 64 P-51 seconds from the 4th Fighter Group. German controllers committed approximately 50 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 300 to intercept the formation. The German fighters assembled at 34,000 feet and began their attack approach using textbook doctrine. What the German pilots observed as they dove toward the bombers appeared initially routine: a standard bomber formation with escorts positioned conventionally around the formation. But as they closed to 3,000 meters, additional fighters became visible, positioned above and slightly ahead of the bombers in attack profiles. The German formation leader faced an impossible decision in the seconds available. Were those fighters German units he hadn't been briefed about? Were they American escorts positioned deceptively? Committing to the attack while uncertainty remained risked flying into an ambush. Aborting the attack meant failing the mission and wasting fuel his unit could not afford to waste. He chose to commit, and his formation flew directly into a perfectly executed trap. 16 P-51 seconds from the 4th Fighter Group had positioned themselves precisely to appear as German attackers on initial observation. As the genuine German fighters entered attack range, the American Mustangs dropped their deceptive positioning and engaged with overwhelming advantage. The Germans had approached without defensive awareness, expecting to find friendly forces or at minimum a conventional escort deployment. They understood how to counter. Instead, they found American fighters already positioned optimally for interception, with altitude advantage, speed advantage, and complete tactical surprise. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. 14 Bf-109s were destroyed. The remaining German fighters scattered and withdrew without making any attack on the bombers. The 4th Fighter Group lost 0 aircraft. The bombers completed their bombing run without a single fighter attack disrupting formation integrity. The entire engagement exemplified bouncing tactics functioning exactly as intended. German expectations manipulated through deceptive positioning, leading to tactical decisions that placed them at fatal disadvantage. German fighter pilot quality had deteriorated so dramatically by March 1945 that even when Luftwaffe pilots recognized bouncing tactics and understood they were being deceived, they frequently lacked the skill and experience necessary to respond effectively. The pilot training program had collapsed under fuel shortages and facility losses. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight time and essentially 0 combat training. These inadequately prepared pilots couldn't adapt to dynamic tactical situations, even when they understood theoretically what was happening. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with over 400 combat missions, described in post-war interviews the hopeless frustration of flying combat operations during the war's final weeks. He noted that even experienced pilots like himself struggled to maintain tactical awareness while managing increasingly unreliable aircraft, navigating through overwhelming Allied fighter presence, and dealing with barely trained wingmen who were more liability than asset. The bouncing tactics, which would have been merely challenging against experienced Luftwaffe formations from 1943, became absolutely devastating against the depleted, poorly trained force of early 1945. The geographic collapse of German-controlled territory during March and April further degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness. Fighter bases were overrun by advancing Allied ground forces, forcing constant relocations that disrupted maintenance, supply chains, and operational continuity. Remaining bases faced continuous strafing attacks from Allied fighters that destroyed aircraft on the ground faster than they could be replaced. The systematic destruction of Germany's fuel production and distribution infrastructure meant that operational sorties became increasingly rare, further reducing pilot proficiency through lack of flight time. By mid-April, Luftwaffe fighter operations had effectively ceased as organized resistance. Individual aircraft occasionally intercepted Allied formations, but coordinated unit-level attacks of the type bouncing tactics were designed to counter had become impossible due to fuel exhaustion, base overruns, and the complete breakdown of command and control infrastructure. The final recorded instance of bouncing tactics being employed occurred on April 16 during a raid on Dresden. A small German fighter formation attempted interception and was destroyed by P-51 positioned in attack profiles. It was a minor engagement, tactically insignificant in the context of Germany's imminent collapse, but represented the final operational validation of tactics that had protected countless bomber crews during the war's final 6 months. The strategic impact of bouncing tactics extended beyond immediate operational effectiveness. The tactic contributed significantly to the sustainability of the strategic bombing campaign during its most critical phase. By late 1944, Allied strategic bombing had finally achieved the industrial targeting accuracy and volume necessary to seriously degrade German war production. Oil facilities, transportation networks, and specialized manufacturing were being systematically destroyed. But these strategic gains required sustained bombing operations that would have been operationally unsustainable if bomber loss rates had remained at mid-1944 levels. Bouncing tactics reduced bomber losses during precisely the period when those losses would have been most strategically costly. Every bomber that survived to fly additional missions represented cumulative tonnage of bombs delivered to German targets. The approximately 200 to 300 bombers saved from fighter attack between November 1944 and April 1945, through improved escort effectiveness, flew thousands of subsequent sorties, delivering tens of thousands of tons of bombs that accelerated Germany's industrial collapse. The human dimension was equally significant. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men. Every bomber saved meant 10 aircrewmen who survived to complete their combat tours and eventually return home. The statistics are straightforward. If bouncing tactics prevented 300 bombers from being shot down, they saved approximately 3,000 American lives, assuming average survival rates for crews of bombers that were successfully attacked. The actual number may have been higher because many attacks prevented by bouncing would have resulted in multiple bomber losses rather than single aircraft. The tactical lessons from bouncing extended into post-war Air Force doctrine development, though not always explicitly acknowledged. The Korean War saw American fighter pilots employing deceptive positioning tactics against North Korean and Chinese air forces, using geography and formations to create tactical ambiguity. Vietnam-era fighter doctrine emphasized flexibility and deception in ways that reflected lessons learned over Germany 2 decades earlier. Modern air combat training incorporates extensive instruction about managing opponent expectations and exploiting cognitive biases, direct descendants of principles that emerged from bouncing tactics. The broader institutional lesson concerned the value of tactical flexibility and commander initiative. The bouncing innovation emerged from mid-level squadron commanders who recognized problems and experimented with solutions without waiting for higher headquarters to develop and approve new doctrine. The success of these local innovations demonstrated the importance of empowering tactical commanders to adapt doctrine to operational realities rather than rigidly adhering to established procedures that weren't producing acceptable results. The contrast with Luftwaffe institutional rigidity proved decisive. German air doctrine by late 1944 had calcified into standardized procedures that reflected bitter lessons learned, but also eliminated the flexibility necessary to counter enemy innovations. The Luftwaffe's deteriorating strategic position made systematic tactical adaptation increasingly impossible, as resource constraints, organizational chaos, and personnel losses overwhelmed institutional capacity for change. Even when individual German units recognized American tactical innovations and developed effective counters, disseminating that knowledge across the force became impractical. Charles Yeager, whose November 7th interception had demonstrated bouncing's potential, survived the war with 11.5 confirmed aerial victories. His post-war career included becoming the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound and achieving flag rank in the Air Force. In later interviews, Yeager consistently downplayed his role in developing bouncing tactics, characterizing the approach as common-sense application of position and timing rather than tactical innovation. He noted that any competent fighter pilot understood the value of surprise, and that bouncing simply formalized what good pilots had been doing instinctively throughout the war. Yeager's modesty aside, the systematic implementation of bouncing represented genuine tactical innovation that emerged from recognizing and exploiting opponent cognitive biases. German pilots expected to see certain tactical patterns and interpreted ambiguous situations through those expectations. American fighters deliberately created situations that reinforced those expectations while actually preparing ambushes. The deception worked because it operated at cognitive level rather than purely visual or technological level. Major Clarence Anderson, the 357th Squadron commander who encouraged early experimentation with offensive positioning, received the Distinguished Service Cross for leadership during the November through March period, when his squadron achieved exceptional combat effectiveness. The citation specifically mentions his role in developing innovative escort tactics, though it doesn't detail what those innovations were. Anderson continued serving in the Air Force post-war, eventually retiring as a colonel after a distinguished career that included career combat and various command positions. The post-war analysis of escort fighter effectiveness, conducted by the Air Force Historical Division, examined thousands of mission reports and combat narratives from the final year of the European Air War. The analysis identified multiple factors contributing to improved bomber protection during late 1944 and early 45. Increased fighter numbers, superior aircraft performance, declining Luftwaffe capabilities, and improved tactics. The tactical improvements received relatively brief discussion compared to material factors, reflecting the difficulty of quantifying tactical innovation's contribution compared to more easily measured variables like aircraft numbers and performance specifications. Several participants in bouncing tactics development wrote about their experiences decades later as the historical significance became clearer. These accounts provide valuable qualitative insight into how the tactics evolved and were refined through combat experience. A common theme across these narratives is the psychological satisfaction of turning German tactical predictability against them. American pilots had spent years adapting to German tactical innovations. The opportunity to innovate themselves and watch German pilots struggle with the same confusion and uncertainty Americans had experienced earlier in the war provided genuine satisfaction beyond mere combat success. The tactical innovation also reflected broader changes in American military culture during World War II. The U.S. military entered the war with limited combat experience and doctrine heavily influenced by theoretical peacetime thinking. 4 years of global combat forced rapid adaptation and created institutional culture that valued practical effectiveness over doctrinal purity. Junior officers who demonstrated tactical competence received unusual latitude to experiment and innovate. Successful innovations spread rapidly through informal networks, even when official doctrine hadn't been updated. This flexibility proved decisive across multiple theaters and service branches. The specific circumstance of late 1944 created ideal conditions for tactical innovation in escort operations. American forces possessed clear material advantages in numbers and aircraft performance. The strategic situation favored continued offensive operations rather than defensive consolidation. These factors reduced the risk associated with tactical experimentation. If bouncing had failed, conventional escort procedures remained viable fallback. The resource margins available to American forces by late 1944 allowed experimentation that would have been impossible earlier in the war, when margins were thinner and failures more costly. German responses to bouncing, to the extent they developed coherent responses, reflected the organizational chaos and resource exhaustion plaguing the Luftwaffe during the war's final months. Some units attempted to counter the tactic through more cautious attack procedures, requiring extensive visual confirmation before committing to attacks. This caution reduced effectiveness and further degraded already unsustainable bomber kill rates. Other units essentially ignored the issue, continuing to employ standard attack procedures and accepting the resulting casualties as inevitable costs of operations. The most sophisticated German response involved using small observer formations positioned well above primary attack groups. These observers would attempt to identify tactical situations before main attack forces committed, specifically looking for American fighters positioned deceptively in attack profiles. The observer concept was doctrinally sound but practically difficult to implement given communication limitations, coordination challenges, and chronic pilot shortages. Few units possessed sufficient aircraft and experienced pilots to implement observer tactics consistently. Those that tried achieved mixed results, occasionally identifying bouncing setups, but frequently missing deceptions or misidentifying genuine tactical situations. The fundamental problem German fighter forces faced was that tactical adaptation required resources, time, and institutional capacity that simply didn't exist by late 1944. Fuel shortages limited both operational sorties and training flights. Experienced pilots and tactical leaders were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. Communication and coordination infrastructure was degrading under Allied bombing. The organizational stability necessary for developing, testing, and implementing new tactics had collapsed. Individual units might innovate locally, but force-wide adaptation was beyond the Luftwaffe's remaining capabilities. The ethical dimensions of bouncing tactics warrant consideration, though they were essentially irrelevant to combat participants. The deception involved was purely tactical, rather than involving false identification or violations of armed conflict laws. American fighters positioned themselves to appear similar to German attackers, but didn't falsely signal German identity or employ ruses forbidden under warfare conventions. The confusion created was tactical rather than fraudulent. German pilots misinterpreted tactical situations based on their expectations, not because Americans were explicitly impersonating German units. The tactic's effectiveness ultimately depended on German doctrinal rigidity and declining pilot quality as much as American innovation. Against a more flexible opponent with better trained pilots and functional command and control, bouncing would have been less effective and more easily countered. The specific historical circumstances of late 1944 created conditions where relatively simple tactical deception produced disproportionate results. This context specificity meant that bouncing couldn't be mechanically replicated in different circumstances without accounting for opponent capabilities and tactical flexibility. The legacy of bouncing tactics in Air Force institutional memory is surprisingly limited given the tactic's operational significance. Most popular histories of the air war focus on aircraft performance, pilot aces, and dramatic combat narratives, rather than doctrinal innovations. The tactical flexibility and commander initiative that enabled bouncing receive less attention than material factors and individual heroism. This emphasis reflects broader patterns in military history, writing that privilege, technology, and individual agency over institutional adaptation and tactical evolution. Modern air combat doctrine incorporates many principles that emerged from bouncing without explicit acknowledgement of the historical lineage. The emphasis on deception, surprise, and exploiting opponent expectations appears throughout Air Force tactical publications. Training programs stress flexibility and adaptability rather than rigid adherence to standardized procedures. These doctrinal features reflect lessons learned across decades of air combat experience, including but not limited to the escort tactics of late 1944. The specific implementation details of bouncing tactics became obsolete almost immediately, as jet aircraft, radar-guided missiles, and beyond visual range combat transformed aerial warfare. The underlying principles, using deception to create tactical advantage and exploiting opponent cognitive biases, remain relevant regardless of technological change. Modern electronic warfare employs these principles extensively, creating false signatures and ambiguous tactical pictures that force opponents to make decisions under uncertainty. The technology changed completely, but the psychology, remains constant. The human stories of individual pilots who practiced bouncing tactics largely disappeared into the broader narrative of American air superiority over Germany. Unlike dramatic dogfight victories that generated ace recognition and Medal of Honor citations, successful bouncing often prevented combat from occurring or enabled quick victories that seemed unremarkable in after-action reports. The pilots who executed perfect intercept timing and positioning that prevented German attacks from developing rarely received recognition commensurate with their contribution to bomber crew survival. This recognition gap reflects the challenge of valuing prevention compared to direct action. The bomber crews who survived because German attacks were prevented or disrupted never knew specifically which fighter pilots had protected them. The fighters that shot down German attackers received credit for kills, but the fighters that prevented attacks from developing through deceptive positioning achieved effects that were harder to quantify and recognize. The statistical evidence shows their contribution clearly, but individual attributions remain difficult decades later. The technological sophistication of the P-51 Mustang deserves emphasis in understanding why American pilots could implement bouncing effectively while German forces couldn't easily counter it. The Mustang's performance advantages in speed, altitude capability, and range created the tactical flexibility necessary for offensive escort positioning. Less capable fighters would have struggled to maintain the altitude and speed necessary for convincing attack profiles while retaining sufficient energy reserves for actual interception. The Merlin engine's exceptional high-altitude performance was particularly critical. Maintaining position at 30,000 feet or above for extended periods required sustained engine output that many fighters couldn't deliver reliably. The two-stage supercharger provided consistent power where other engines gasped for air. This capability allowed American fighters to remain positioned offensively throughout missions without sacrificing defensive capability or forcing premature return to base due to fuel exhaustion. The Mustang's handling characteristics at high altitude enabled precise positioning necessary for bouncing to work effectively. The aircraft remained responsive and controllable at altitudes where other fighters became sluggish and unresponsive. Pilots could make fine adjustments to maintain optimal positioning relative to bomber formations without fighting against the aircraft. This handling quality reduced pilot workload and allowed concentration on tactical situation rather than aircraft control. Range remained the Mustang's most significant strategic advantage and directly enabled bouncing tactics operational implementation. The P-51 could escort bombers throughout entire missions deep into Germany, while maintaining sufficient fuel reserves for extended combat maneuvering and multiple engagement attempts. This endurance provided the patience necessary for offensive positioning. American pilots could maintain deceptive positions for hours, waiting for German attacks that might develop anywhere along extended mission routes. German fighters operating near maximum range couldn't afford such patience and tactical flexibility. The final weeks of the European War saw bouncing tactics employed less frequently as German fighter opposition essentially ceased. By late April 1945, Luftwaffe operational capability had collapsed to the point where escorted bomber formations rarely encountered German fighters at all. The missions continued, targeting transportation infrastructure and remaining military facilities, but air opposition had become negligible. The escort fighters increasingly shifted to ground attack missions, strafing targets of opportunity and conducting armed reconnaissance rather than providing bomber protection. The last major strategic bombing mission of the European War occurred on April 25, 1945, targeting rail yards and transportation facilities near Salzburg. Over 300 bombers participated, escorted by approximately 120 fighters. German fighter opposition was minimal, sporadic, and tactically ineffective. A few Bf-109s attempted interception, but were quickly driven off by escorts without making serious attack runs. The mission illustrated how completely Allied air superiority had been achieved and how thoroughly German fighter capability had been destroyed. Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, arrived less than 2 weeks later. The strategic bombing campaign officially ended, though escort fighters continued flying patrols over occupied Germany for several weeks as Allied ground forces consolidated control. The pilots who had developed and refined bouncing tactics transitioned to occupation duties, training missions, or preparation for redeployment to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan continued. The institutional knowledge embodied in these pilots and squadron commanders largely dispersed during post-war demobilization. The Army Air Forces contracted dramatically from its wartime peak of over 2 million personnel to fewer than 400,000 within 18 months. Most combat veterans returned to civilian life, taking their tactical knowledge with them. Some remained in the newly independent Air Force formed in 1947, but the peacetime force focused on strategic nuclear deterrence rather than conventional tactical aviation, creating limited institutional demand for World War II escort fighter tactics. The Korean War's outbreak in 1950 forced rapid relearning of conventional air combat tactics as Air Force fighter pilots discovered that strategic nuclear doctrine provided limited guidance for tactical air superiority missions over Korea. Veterans of the European Air War were recalled to service and provided invaluable institutional memory about fighter tactics, including deceptive positioning and offensive escort procedures. These recalled veterans became the transmission belt carrying World War II tactical lessons into the jet age. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.